In this presentation, I'll describe the evolution of Korea's 5G wireless network, and in particular the application of optics in the fronthaul part of the network. First, I will go into a little bit of details on the Korean mobile phone market. The population of South Korea is 51.3 million. Of that, 50% of them live in the Greater Seoul metropolitan area. Other urban areas amount to about 32%, and only 18% of the population live in rural areas. There are 70.1 million subscriptions in South Korea. Almost 20% of those are 5G subscriptions. The vast majority of the rest is LTE with about 78%. There are three carriers serving the South Korean market. SK Telecom with a 46.5% market share at the end of April, KT with a market share of 30.4%, and LGU Plus is the third carrier with a market share of 23%. The initial frequency auction for 5G happened in June of 2018. The total amount in from the auction was $3.3 billion. There was auction off 280 megahertz in the midband, around 3.5 gigahertz for a 10-year term. And you can see the distribution on the three carriers here. LGU Plus got 80 megahertz, KT 100 megahertz, and SK Telecom also got 100 megahertz. In addition, each of the carriers got 800 megahertz in the high band, around 28 gigahertz, and this was for a 5-year term. There are other frequency ranges available that likely will be auctioned off in the future. And I've listed some of those here at the bottom. So OE Solution plays a role in this because it is a global supplier of optical transceivers for access networks, and in particular access networks that needs extreme temperature ranges, bidirectional transmission features, and so on. The majority of our product today goes into wireless X-haul, so front haul, mid haul, and back haul. We also have a large presence in fixed broadband, transport and interconnect, and we have a portfolio of smart SFPs that we kind of call network enhancements. These serve network migration and service assurance purposes in carrier networks. The services in Korea are mapped onto the optical spectrum using a CWDM grid. And I'm here showing an example from KT. This here shows the spectrum before 5G deployment started. And you can see how different services or different phases of deployments of services are mapped into different CWDM bands. You'll also see in the light blue that the Vibro, for example, which is a South Korean version of WiMAX, occupied 2 of these bands. When KT started introducing 5G, they converted these 2 Vibro bands into 5G and basically terminated Vibro services. They also applied 2 new bands at the lower end such that they have 4 CWDM bands that are now serving 5G. 3 of them at the low end, 1270, 1290, and 1310 nanometers. These are all occupied by 25 gig LAN WDM transceivers. The 4th band in the C band, around 1550, is a 10 gig DWDM band. The architecture looks like this, with the CWDM muxes and demuxes connecting to a single fiber. Then in the case of 5G, there's a second layer of multiplexing and demultiplexing, which allows DWDM signals to be combined and then injected into a CWDM band. You can see the advantages of this is that one can deploy new services in a band or reconfigure a band without affecting the traffic that is still live in the other bands. The 3 carriers are using fairly similar network architectures. You will see for all three of them, they're using a direct connection between the active antenna units and the central unit. SK Telecom, though, has one variation where they are using a ring connection in some regions, connecting back to a 5G network hub that is then connected to the central unit. They're using quite different transceivers, though, which all depends on the frequencies or wavelengths that they chose to deploy 5G into. For KT, as we discussed before, they're using 10G DWDM for the smaller MIMO antennas, and this is deployed in the C-band around 1550. And they're using 25G LAN WDM to serve higher order MIMO antennas. LGU Plus is using 10G DWDM, and SK Telecom is using 10G O-band DWDM to connect between the central unit and the active unit. In the ring configurations, they're also using a semi-tunable version of this, which is a tunable that covers a few of the wavelengths in the band. You'll see also that in all cases, they're using 25G gray optics, and these are BiDis, to connect the central unit back into the network. After the initial frequency auction in June of 2018, they all started deployments in the second half. This was fairly aggressive, such that they could launch actually some limited business services already at the beginning of December 2018. Consumer services followed pretty quickly also, and all of the three carriers launched on the same day in April of 2019. 2019 was planned to be a deployment year for Midband exclusively, essentially building up coverage and densifying the network. And then 2020 was planned to be the first year of deployments in the Highband. When 2020 came around, the situation, of course, was evaluated, and the general consensus was that subscribers were not happy with the coverage. They expected better coverage in the midband, and therefore the decision was taken to continue with the densification of the midband. The carriers did have commitments to deploy Highband to start deployment within the year of 2020, but they renegotiated that and committed to investing $22 billion into the Highband before the end of 2022. The compromise also meant that each of them now had a target of 5,000 active antenna units per carrier in the Highband. So Highband deployment will begin in the second half of this year to further kind of help their return on investment and also speed up deployment. Some of the service providers have agreed on joint use of some equipment to cover the rural part of the network, which is about 15 to 18% of the population. There's a second frequency auction planned as well, and we expect that this will probably take place in the latter half of this year. The original plan specified a deployment of 240,000 active antenna units in 2019 and 2020, and then smaller numbers of 180,000 and 100,000 in 21 and 22. In reality, they actually exceeded the goal in 2019 and deployed close to 250,000 units. 2020, though, the deployment was only just below half of what was planned, with just a little bit over 100,000 units. And for 2021, we are also expecting the deployment to be around 100,000 antenna units again. Looking at the transceivers that have been deployed for that, the upper chart here shows the transceiver counts for each of the two bit rates. At 25 gigabit per second, by the end of 2021, we expect that about 300,000 units have been deployed. At 10 gigabit per second, the number is higher, around 800,000 units. Interestingly enough, if you look at the bandwidth supported by each of the bit rates, it's fairly similar. simply just from the differences in the speeds, of course. This here gives you a visual of the evolution of the coverage of the midband as that was being deployed. This chart here shows the coverage maps at 3 different times during 2019. The first one being May 10. So this is just a month after the launch of consumer services. And then there's a column for August and one for November. And you can see, as expected, that the map is filling in. You can also see that it is centered on Seoul, plus in particular for the next 4 large metro areas in Korea, and then also some of the common business routes or traffic routes in the country. Now, as I mentioned before, 2020 became also a year of densification, and there's 2 more columns shown here for February and December. And you can see further densification of the network. And in particular, you can see some geographies getting a larger share of the new deployments, and in particular, deployments around traffic routes or arteries is getting redder and getting a better coverage. For your information, I included a snapshot of the service plans that are being sold in Korea. On the left side, you see the LTE plans as they're sold today. And on the right side, you see the 5G plans that are being offered. Interesting, when you compare these, you will see that for unlimited bandwidth, the 5G plans are actually cheaper than the LTE plans. And the difference is about 5%. If you look at the lower plans, you will see that on average, the price really varies very little. So the price for the lower plans has been kept, but the data, the amount of data that is being promised to customers for that demand has increased quite significantly. So overall, there's a strong push towards the consumers to convert from their LTE plans and into the 5G plans. Of course, at the same time, there's also fierce competition between the carriers to take advantage of this conversion to improve their share of the market. So the early adopters were lured mostly by augmented reality and virtual reality-based entertainment. And this has been kind of pushed with easy-to-wear lightweight glasses, as you can see on the image here. These ones are offered by LGU+. And also with higher performance enclosed headsets, as you have undoubtedly seen in the press in the past. There's still questions that remain about the business applications, whether they will be able to drive the cost of deployment of the high band because of greater needs and greater willingness to pay for that bandwidth. Right now, the plan is to tie the high band deployments with business services and make the business case that way. In the meantime, the Korean government continues to push 5G as a critical national infrastructure for the future, and also for its ability to maintain a position amongst the leaders in wireless technology.